So who has the power in the negotiation process with the freight broker, the shipper, and the carrier? Who has the might? Who has the strength in that relationship? I think each of those entities have a balance of power when the negotiation process starts. But as it starts to move forward, the balance of power shifts based on who does the best negotiating. So let's take a look at the freight broker, the shipper, and the carrier. First, we'll start by talking about shippers. Shippers are a key player and in a very powerful position within the freight market. And that's because they have all of what we need, and it's freight. You see, freight is the gold in this business. Freight is the needle mover, and shippers know that. So they leverage that freight because they have many different freight brokers, many different carriers that they can offer the freight to. And because of this competition, it drives down cost. But shippers also have an Achilles heel. They have that kryptonite also. And that kryptonite is they have customers that need that freight, and they need that freight in a timely manner. And sometimes they can't go through the negotiation process to its completion. They have to get freight moved and get it moved quickly, and sometimes that drives their cost up. So although the freight is the product and it is everything that the freight broker and the carrier needs, it also causes problems for the shipper. The better the shipper uses its resources to manage this problem, the more likely they'll hit their freight spend goals. And a shipper is operating in its power when it has time on its side and options. When it has less time and less options, then the power shifts. Now let's discuss who the power could potentially shift to. We have two other players in the game, the freight broker and the carrier. Let's start by talking about the freight broker. Where does a freight broker's power come from? Well, the name of the game is assets. The more assets you have, the more power you have. And a freight broker's power comes through its carrier network. The bigger, the stronger the carrier network, the more connected that freight broker is to the network, the more power the freight broker has. And although there's power in building that carrier network, the superpower comes when the freight broker can connect its carrier network to its customer base. That's where the real power comes in, because you can have a carrier network and not know how to connect that network, and you just have a network. But when you can marry those two together and make them work, that's when the magic happens. A freight broker's power is diminished as he loses control over freight, when he's not as connected to his carrier network, when his carrier network is no longer as available as they once were. When you have too many carriers, now you have excessive carriers in the space, and the service that you offer is about offering trucks, and there are already too many, that can cause some problems. And also, the freight broker can dilute the market as well. He can pollute the market by driving costs too far down in some lanes, making it hard for himself and for carriers. Now let's talk about the carrier. The carrier also has power. And this power comes through the manpower that it offers to move the load from point A to point B. The asset that it provides to move the load from point A to point B. All of the energy, effort, the knowledge to actually move the load from point A to point B comes through the carrier. So the carrier is a very valuable asset. But remember, before we said that the trucking industry is an asset-driven industry. Whether you own them or you control those assets, because an owner-operator usually has just one truck, he doesn't really have a lot of leverage. He only has that one truck, right? So when it comes down to being able to really change or affect pricing, he really doesn't have that capability, not by himself. I think that owner-operators are probably in the most disadvantaged position when it comes to having power within this industry because of that asset piece, not having control or owning enough assets. And when you don't own enough assets, don't control enough of those assets, then there has to be unity amongst small trucking companies who are in the position of the 1 and the 2 trucks, which is most of small trucking companies. But I really don't ever see that type of unity in the trucking world. And the reason for that is because there are so many different trucking companies with so many different agendas. And if you don't accept one rate, then another trucker will come behind you and accept a rate. I think the pendulum of power swings back and forth between shippers, freight brokers, and carriers. But at the end of the day, It's the bigger freight brokerages, the more established shipping companies that get to take advantage of the smaller trucking companies. When trucking companies are small and do not have as many resources, are not as well established, they accept things from those larger companies that they wouldn't normally accept if they were just doing business with that someone was of the same size, that had the same amount of leverage. But because they're working with bigger companies and these companies control more of the freight that they need, they sometimes consider it a trade-off to go ahead and move a lane or move some lanes at a discounted rate now, thinking that you'll get better rates as you continue to move freight with these companies. But when companies get locked into rates, especially when they're low rates, they don't want them to change. So sometimes you set a market unintentionally, you're polluting and diluting your own market without really knowing it. So who's in a better position? Is it the freight broker, the shipper, or the carrier? I personally like the position of the freight broker, and I understand that my opinion might be a little bit biased because I am a freight broker, but if you look at the position of the freight broker, he is in the best position, I believe, to scale. Because he doesn't have to buy assets, he has to get relationships going with people who have assets. As compared to the truck driver, he's having to buy or lease those assets, having to spend much more money than a freight broker would have to spend. So scaling is what's on my mind, and when I look at it from a scale perspective, I would have to say that the freight broker is in a better position. Let us know who you think is in the best position by dropping a comment below. And I also want to make you aware that Alliance Logistics has now partnered with TRUCKSTOP. They have been our load board provider for the last 8 years. It's an excellent load board, and I can't say enough good things about it. They have now given us the opportunity to offer it to our viewing audience, and there's a link in the description box that will give you a free month when you sign up with our link. So make sure you hit the description box and find that link so that you can get your month free with TRUCKSTOP. So until the next time, I wish you the very best in your life and business. See you all the way at the top of the mountain, because the bottom is much too crowded.